This wooden structure, resembling a Native American totem, was found in the swamp between Fieldstone Drive and Route 3A more than 40 years ago, approximately in 1976. I don't know if you know this name or not, but the owner's name is Robert Panico, P-A-N-I-C-O, and his son, who was a young boy at the time, was digging for turtles when he came upon the structure in the swamp. So he called his dad, and former Burlington resident Robert Panico, Mike's dad, sent the structure to the Burlington Historical Society, sent it to my house for possible identification. Is it Native American? And that was about 4 years ago, and all my kids saw it on my dining room table. They'd say, Mom, you know, it's kind of scary. You get this guy out of here. So he went to the museum. Now we've reached out to the Burlington public, to Native American associations, to Washington Museum of Native Americans, to the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian put us in contact with the last specialist, the end of the research as far as I was concerned, Mr. Edward Leonard, who's a consulting archaeologist. And he said he does not believe it's Native American. And I have a lot of paperwork that I'm not going to read to you that he wrote discussing why, what kind of things that the Native American used to carve and what we don't know about it. So maybe someday someone visiting the museum will have further information. So in the last, well, close to 4 years, nobody going into the museum has seen anything familiar. I know Mr. Panico. Until a museum in Medford, the Royal House and Slave Quarters. Has anyone ever been there? I've never been there. And they responded. And their program manager listened and recommended the Boston African American National Historic Site. And this website led us to Shawn Quigley, I asked him, by the way, this is, I'm just interjecting this, that you have to be handsome to be a ranger. He just blushed. Shawn will speak. I'm so happy to have you here. You can see how hard we've tried to find out, if anything, on this. And maybe you might have some insight into who he is. But Shawn, I welcome you here, and we're glad to have you. We're ready to hear from you.
So I really appreciate everybody asking me to come out and hearing me speak today. A little bit about the history here regarding the Underground Railroad. So what I'm going to be doing over kind of the next half hour, 45 minutes, is really kind of going into depth, exploring the Underground Railroad itself and what the Underground Railroad would have been like here in Massachusetts, and really specifically kind of through the lens of Boston into the surrounding areas. Just as a quick background, I've been a national park ranger, actually with the National Parks of Boston and Boston African American National Historic Site for about 7.5 years. So I've been researching a lot of this stuff, and it is definitely something that I am passionate about, I care a lot about, and I hope that at the end of this you will too. I think when we think of the Underground Railroad, a lot of things often come to mind. And what I always like to do when I start this conversation is, because I think a lot of people have heard of the Underground Railroad, and this actually works out perfectly because all of you are sitting at round tables with each other. I like to do what's called, it's called a technique that's referred to as like a turn and talk. But what I'd like you to do is take about 2 minutes. Talk with the people at your table about what you know about the Underground Railroad, and then we'll report back and I'll take some answers about what kind of everyone here thinks of when they think of the Underground Railroad. So if you don't know everybody, make some friends. take, let's say I'll take 3 responses. So show of hands, would anybody like to volunteer what they just talked about? Right here. Yes.
Well, we talked about what we knew, which was that to get black slaves out of the south and up through the north and hopefully to Canada, that some of them were recaptured, that they used quilts to guide the way, that some of the songs, like Follow the Drinking Gourd, also had something to do with following the trail to get home. What else was on? Oh, that somebody in Burlington's house was involved with the Underground Railroad. They had, and that's, I think, the title.
Sir?
I was told at one time that the Greenview Farms, before the renovation, had a room upstairs that was a hidden room for the slaves, for the Underground Railroad.
Yes. So what I'll do is then I will pass around the microphone to the next person. I realize that not everyone can probably hear that. There were signs. So to kind of summarize, local stories, songs that people, heard, used that to go north. People tried to escape from slavery, head to Canada. That was a safe space. And also sometimes people were recaptured.
Have you heard of the Governor Bellingham house?
I have not heard of the Governor Bellingham house.
Chelsea?
I have not.
The big house has been back in the 1700s, and in that house, a friend of mine is the Chelsea historian. He's 97 years old, and he's still got a model, excuse me, but that's what, he's a nice man. And so you in for the tour, in the fireplace in the kitchen, a huge fireplace. And then on the right side was all the firewood piled up. Behind that door, they had dug a tunnel. And it went down, under the ground, and all the way up to where the soldiers' home is now. And they built that for years, they built it. And it's still there, but no one can go in it because you wouldn't want to be in there if it caved in. But that's fact from him.
Yeah, so it was, sorry, what was the name of the home again?
Governor Bellingham House
Governor Bellingham House in Chelsea?
on Parker Street.
Secret tunnel.
Huh?
Passageways. Tunnel going somewhere. Yeah. Just summarizing, yes. So secret passageway with a tunnel. And then one more person. Anybody else? Have anything else they want to add to what they think of when they think of the Underground Railroad? Yes.
Where I grew up, there was a house in Newton called the Jackson Homestead, which was part of the Underground Railway. And in 4th grade, all the kids in Newton, that was their 4th grade trip. They take you through this house when you were studying the Civil War, and they'd show you some of the hidden passages and all. So I've always had sort of a fascination for it. I recently read a book.
Put the
called-
microphone closer to your mouth, we can't hear you.
I recently read a book called, I think, The Map Maker's Daughter, about someone who's a relative of John Brown, and she learned to, she was a painter, and she learned to paint paintings that were actually maps. They need to have like non-verbal ways to sort of follow the trail, and that was one of the ways. There was somebody mentioned the quilts that had the quilts had like directional information. They navigated by the stars. They were some of the sympathizers had these paintings in their house, which would have like a map that they could memorize. There's that river, and you go that way in that river. I've heard of dolls being used where would have information inside. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That's very fascinating. And the Jackson Homestead is definitely one of those sites that is worth visiting if you haven't visited yet. So, I really get that common sense. When you think of the Underground Railroad, really, when I ask that question, I get a lot of similar responses. Homes in your town. Kind of you grow up with that lore, the history, the space that you live, and that's a part of that. The Underground Railroad is definitely something that has been, I think, really kind of almost swept up into American mythology in the same way that like Paul Revere's ride is. You hear about these things, you know that they exist, you visited a home like the Jackson Homestead or the house in Chelsea, but it's almost something that, like Paul Revere's ride, you know that it happened, but it's kind of almost hard to wrap your head around because it has been so swept up in American mythology. But this is very real. You know, these were real people. You know, you hear the names like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. Once again, Moses of her people. She was real. She was a real person. She was here in Massachusetts. She came to Boston. Frederick Douglass, same thing, came to Boston himself. You know, I mean, this is a network that, you know, we do think of those kind of single homes, but it is organized. There are groups, people coming together, aiding fugitives escaping from enslavement, helping them make their way north, and eventually making their way to Canada. And we'll get into a little bit more details regarding kind of the groups of people, who's involved in this, how are people escaping from slavery. But I do want to just kind of give just some quick facts about it. Now, obviously, this is an illegal act, so we don't necessarily have detailed information about how many people successfully made their way north. But according to one historian named Eric Fonner, estimates from 1830 to roughly, you know, the American Civil War, every year, an estimated 1,000 to 5,000 people would make that journey on the Underground Railroad, escaping from slavery, coming north to freedom. The term Underground Railroad, you see it really beginning in the early 1840s. One of the first documented accounts of that term being used is in 1842 with a newspaper that says, in Albany, New York, 26 fugitives passed through the city and all went by the Underground Railroad. You know, this is a nickname that is very much fitting to the inventions of the times. You know, the railroad is a decade, if that, you know, it's very much in its infancy. And this is a very important network because what this did is it helped people escape from the horrors of the institution of slavery, the horrors of bondage. Now, what I do want to do is, you know, as we explore this journey, I kind of want to do it in the sense of that journey. I want to look at why people would want to escape from the institution of slavery, how they would go about it, and what they would find when they got here. But people who are going to try and escape from that institution of slavery, you know, I think it's always important to come back to how this is affecting individual people, because that's what it did. The institution of slavery, we think of it in broad terms, 4 million people enslaved. But what happens to those individuals? Why are people leaving their homes to come to a space at great risk to their own personal safety where they know nobody? Now, the next pictures I'm going to show you, they're pretty famous images, but they can, you know, definitely create a bit of an emotional response. So I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of forewarning. But I mean, these are real reasons why you'd want to escape from slavery. You know, I think we think of the Underground Railroad as very much a success story. It fits into that American mythology narrative again of people escaping something so horrible and successfully doing so. But this is the reality that individuals in the 1800s are facing. You know, I mean, families can be torn apart at any moment. If you're caught escaping from slavery, or just if don't work hard enough or something along those lines, you can have results of what you see on the right-hand side. And this is a very famous image that was circulated right around the time of the American Civil War, and it was a man named, simply known as Gordon, who made his way to the Union lines. And when you know, he's in rags, he's getting new clothing, and they use this as an opportunity to take a picture and share with many people in the North to, you know, explore and explain the realities of that institution of slavery. But with these, as I said, 1,000 to 5,000 people are going to make that journey every year. And one of the things that we talked about when we talked about what do you think of when you think of the Underground Railroad, those safe houses, those spaces. Not everybody is going to escape on the Underground Railroad on overland routes using those quilts. Many people are actually going to escape by any way that they can. And for many port cities, They are going to escape via ship. Now, obviously, on the left-hand side here, you see Frederick Douglass. And I think what he does is, like he often did, he very much captures that intense feeling, that agony of what it was like to make that decision to escape from slavery. And as he says, no man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained. Not everyone is going to escape successfully, but he is a good example of somebody who does. The second time. First time, he does not escape successfully. That is correct. Frederick Douglass, through the help of his future wife, will acquire clothing, dressing up as a sailor, forge papers, pretending that he is a free black sailor. And that is an important thing to note, because many people, when escaping from slavery, because maritime ports, they're diverse workforces, many people are going to escape via ship. Now, if you're coming from somewhere like, say, Norfolk, Virginia, it's about 500 plus miles away. If you get on a boat and take that boat to Boston, if you have good weather, you're here in 4 days. It's an ideal way for somebody to escape on the Underground Railroad, and not necessarily something that we think of when we think of the Underground Railroad. But that maritime industry was crucial, especially to places like Boston, New Bedford, anywhere on the coast. So a fugitive is stowing away on a ship. Maybe they had a friendly crew that they talked to, a ship captain, or they just snuck on board themselves. What happens when they get here? Well, there's a network, that Underground Railroad network, people that are involved in that network that are aiding fugitives. And one individual in Boston that really helped that was a man by the name of Austin Bierce. You can probably guess by this image what his profession was, but he was indeed a ship captain. And Austin Bierce grew up in Barnstable, Massachusetts, but he actually engaged in trade with the South. That was his initial profession. He was a mate on a ship, and he experienced the institution of slavery firsthand. He would go on those journeys into the South. He would see ports with enslaved people, see places with slave markets. And through his experience with this, what he decides is that he will never trade below the Mason-Dixon line again. He changes his career path. He will join anti-slavery societies in Boston, and as you can see right here, this is an account book from an organization we're going to talk about a little bit later. Well, Austin Bierce's name on this one page is highlighted 4 times. Now by day, what Austin Bierce did was he was in charge of a ship. It's called the Moby Dick. And as you can see by this, the Moby Dick was a ship that was doing pleasure parties in the harbor, taking people out for cruises, fishing. It's catered. But by night, Austin Bierce would use this ship to help rescue stowaways discovered on Southern ships in Boston Harbor. He would write his memoirs called Reminiscences of the Fugitive Slave Law Days. And there are many stories that he was involved in, but there is one in particular that I always like to tell when talking about Austin Bierce. So, has anyone here been to Castle Island before? Yeah. So one night word came to Austin Bierce that there was a stowaway on board a ship right outside of Castle Island. Austin Bierce was at Long Wharf in Boston, and he would board his ship, the Moby Dick. He would take it out to that vessel where the stowaway was. He would pull up next to the boat and tell the captain, hand over the stowaway. And the captain basically tells Austin Bierce, I'm going to blow you into eternity if you try and board my ship and take this stowaway. Austin Bierce turns around. He goes back to Long Wharf. He tries to get a group of people to come with him, but he can't find anybody who will get on his ship and help him. So what he does is he had a lot of clothing on board his boat. He will fasten coats, hats to the side of his ship, making it look like he has a large crew. He will go back to Castle Island. He will get to that ship where the stowaway is, and essentially tell the captain, I have returned, and now I have more men hand over the stowaway. The captain does so. Austin Bierce goes back to Long Wharf. That stowaway escapes, makes his way north to Canada, remains free for the rest of his life. The next day, a newspaper ad will be taken out in Boston, and it will put a $500 reward out for the pirate who boarded his ship last night and took his property. So this is something that is very much a part of that Underground Railroad. It's an extension of it because, you think of those overland routes, but the harbor is crucial. This is still very much a maritime economy. Ships are coming in and out. People are escaping from that institution by any means necessary. But you do very much have that overland route. Now, I heard mention quilts as signs. There are plenty of other ways that people, when escaping, going to a neighborhood, going to a town, going to the Jackson homestead, finding a sympathetic person who will not only take that individual who's escaping from slavery in, but also give them directions, going to that next space. You can only imagine what is going through that person's head who is escaping from that institution of slavery. They don't know anybody. They have to have a lot of inherent trust in strangers. They are putting their lives in other people's hands. I can't even imagine how terrifying, how stressful, how anxious that would be. And that anxiety was very much compounded in 1850. Because in 1850, with the passing of the Federal Fugitive Slave Law. Has anyone here heard of the Fugitive Slave Law before? A few hands. So the Fugitive Slave Law was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. This is a compromise, federal government, where you have California being admitted to the Union as a free state. The southern slave states do not want basically the entire West Coast to become a free state, so they want something in return. One of the major concessions from the northern states was this Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law was a law that allowed for United States Marshals to come to any northern state or territory and essentially kidnap people, bringing them back to the institution of slavery. The law also stated that if you were caught with a fugitive in your home, so if you were operating an Underground Railroad safe house, you were free, but a fugitive was found inside your home, you would go to jail for 6 months, and you would pay a $1,000 fine. Now, $1,000 in 1850 is roughly equivalent to $28,000 in today's money. So obviously this is no small feat. You could also be deputized on the spot. What that means is if I was walking down the street, someone points to me and says, help me stop that person, and I don't do it, I'd be liable to be arrested under that Fugitive Slave Law. So naturally, this law scares a lot of people all throughout the North. And what this also does is it brings the institution of slavery to the North. Because for many people, 1850, slavery was a Southern problem. I think 2019, it's often easy to kind of think hindsight, look back 150 years, I'd be an abolitionist. But in 1850, slavery was in the South. Massachusetts already abolished slavery, did so in 1783. Slavery is protected by the United States Constitution. What are we supposed to do? But with this Fugitive Slave Law, making people complicit and arresting and helping arrest fugitives and bringing them back to the South, creates a more militant community. And one community in particular, on the north slope of Beacon Hill, is a community, Boston's free African American community, and this is a strong group of activists, willing to not only speak out against the institution of slavery, but act. They create an organization called the Boston Vigilance Committee. Now that was the sheet that I showed you with Austin Bierce. So what you see on the left-hand side here, this is a poster that would have appeared all throughout Boston. And essentially what it is saying, and as you can see, caution, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have a top eye open. These are appearing all throughout the neighborhood, lampposts, trees, etc. And you also get this organization, which is not just limited to Boston. This very much extends throughout Massachusetts. Now, the Boston Vigilance Committee, it is an interracial organization. And it really is like the financial backing of the Underground Railroad. Now, if we go back to this image of Austin Bierce here, what you can see here, this is a page from their account book. Because I don't really know why they would do this, but they kept meticulous financial records of everything that they were doing, which helps us really paint a great picture of what the Underground Railroad would have looked like and how detailed it was in this area. But, if this account book gets found, everybody on this list is going to jail. But fortunately, it survived, and we have it. And, you can look at these lists, and the handwriting is a little bit hard to read, but it talks about fundraising efforts, which Austin Bierce was a part of, reimbursing individuals for buying fugitives clothing, food, providing shelter, sending them north. This is a very intricate, organized, and detailed group. And they help scores of fugitives escape. But you need individual people. People willing to take that risk. People willing to, despite the heavy fines, potential jail time, be willing to help fugitives make their way north. And one individual who helped do that on many occasions was a man named Lewis Hayden. Now, Lewis Hayden is featured on the left, and on the right-hand side you see his home, which still stands today and is a part of the Black Heritage Trail walking tour, which the National Park Service does during the summer months. Now, Lewis Hayden was not born in Massachusetts. He was born in Kentucky, and he was born enslaved. He would escape from the institution of slavery. He would make his way north, settle in Boston, and turn that home into one of the most well-known Underground Railroad safe houses in Massachusetts, helping dozens, if not hundreds, of fugitives make their way to freedom. His home earned the nickname as the Temple of Refuge. And with this next story, I think you'll understand why. So he's got hundreds of fugitives walking through that door. But probably two of the most famous are two people by the name of William and Ellen Craft. Now, William and Ellen Craft were not from Massachusetts. They were also enslaved in Macon, Georgia, very far away from Massachusetts. And when they determined it was time to escape from the institution of slavery, they did so in a very unique way. As you can kind of tell by this image here, Ellen Craft, on the left, she's very light-skinned. She can pass as white. So when they decide it's time to escape, what they do, they cut off Ellen's hair. They dress her up in men's clothing. And they pretend that she is the sick white slave master of her husband, William. And rather than utilizing the Underground Railroad, they will purchase train tickets. They will board a train in Macon, Georgia, and they will take that train from Georgia to Massachusetts and to freedom. Now, obviously, this is a very bold move. So in order to pull something like this off, some serious precautions are going to have to be taken. One thing that they do is they put bandages around Ellen's face. Hides her lack of a beard, and as a young African-American woman portraying a white man, the less she speaks, the better off she is. They also put her right arm, as you can see here, in a sling. It's illegal for people who are enslaved to learn how to read or write. Ellen Craft did not know how to write. But if she puts her right arm in a sling, she can pretend that her arm is broken She doesn't have to sign any documentation proving who she is. So they make their way north. They come to Massachusetts. They go around in this area. They start telling their story, joining anti-slavery lecture circuits. As you can imagine, this story is the makings of this great Hollywood drama. It's popular. People are intrigued. But that popularity grows too large because their story makes their way back to the South, to Macon, Georgia, where their former masters here were staying. And they escaped in December of 1849. Wait about a year, it's 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law is passed. So, 3 slave catchers are dispatched to Boston, coming to this house. Now, as the story goes, William Craft was at the Hayden house here, Ellen Craft was not. The slave catchers will go up the steps, start pounding on the front door, screaming at Lewis Hayden to release William Craft, knowing that he's in there wanting to get him back, bring him and eventually his wife to the institution of slavery. But Lewis Hayden will have other ideas. He will open the front door very calmly. In one hand, he has a lit torch. And he will tell the slave catchers that if you take one more step towards my home, I'll drop the torch, which doesn't seem like a big deal with the house being made of brick, but when he actually opens the door a little bit wider, he reveals that there are multiple kegs of gunpowder sitting by his front steps. He drops that torch, that whole place, that block, is going to go up. But the house is still here, so obviously that did not happen. Slave catchers do not take another step forward. Shouting ensues. The neighborhood chases them away. William and Ellen Craft escape. They will leave the country. They will go to England. They will stay there until the end of the American Civil War. And once there, they learn how to read and write. They write their memoirs. It's called Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom and is actually where we get this image of Ellen Craft. And after the war, when slavery has ended, they will move back to Macon, Georgia, where they will open up a school for newly freed men, women, and children to teach them what they had been denied in their youth while enslaved. And that's the power of the Underground Railroad. That's the power of helping people gain their freedom. The willingness to go that extra mile. That's what many in this community, in these surrounding areas, and many small towns throughout the northern United States, that's what they would do. But with the Underground Railroad, not every story is a success. And with that fugitive slave law, that line had been drawn between aiding people escape from slavery and how far the United States government was willing to return them to that institution. Now what you see here is an image of a courthouse. It's a federal courthouse, right by the old State House if you've ever been into downtown Boston. The name up top you see is Shadrach Minkins. Shadrach Minkins is one of the first real tests of that fugitive slave law in Boston. Shadrach Minkins is arrested under that law in February of 1851. So this would have been a little over a year after the Crafts escaped and made their way to England. He's brought to this courthouse where he's going to be tried, and no doubt in his mind that he's going to be sent back to the institution of slavery. However, the members of that free black community, Lewis Hayden leading the charge, they will hear about this, they will march down to the courthouse, they will break inside, they will overpower the guards, they will grab Shadrach Minkins, and they will physically spring him from prison, carry him to that Beacon Hill neighborhood, about a mile away, where a carriage is gotten. Shadrach is taken to Cambridge. Then he's taken to Concord, Massachusetts. And then 5 days later, he is in Montreal, Canada, a free man. And a letter of his will be published in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator newspaper, an anti-slavery publication. And it will essentially say, and it's from Shadrach Minkins. He did not write it himself. But it says, I am grateful for those dear and kind friends in Boston. And believe me, I shall always consider it my duty to pray for their health and happiness. Your grateful servant, Shadrach Niggins, Montreal, Canada, free man. So, quite literally, a man is broken out of federal prison. A man who escaped on that Underground Railroad. A man who made it here to Massachusetts. And he was broken out. But not everybody was. And this very much is something that truly does galvanize the northern United States. Wedges a further divide. And that divide is very much felt in 1854. So the image that you see here is of a man named Anthony Burns. He would escape on the Underground Railroad via ship. Comes from Virginia, comes to Boston. He's arrested, brought to that courthouse that Shadrach was held at. In response, there was a meeting called at Faneuil Hall. This is a broadside that was put all around the city. And at that meeting, that Friday evening, 5,000 people packed inside that building to try and determine what Massachusetts' response was going to be to his arrest. That meeting would break up. People would march down to the courthouse. They would try and break inside, but they would be unsuccessful. Anthony Burns would be brought back to Virginia. There were federal marshals, there were United States Marines brought to downtown Boston to ensure that he is brought back. But while there were 200 or so Marines, tens of thousands of people, estimated up to 50,000 people, came out into the streets to protest this. 50,000 people. It's estimated that the population of Boston at this time period was roughly 110,000. And these are not just people coming from Boston. They are coming from all over Massachusetts. But quite literally on a half a mile stretch, you have that many people showing up to protest this one person, this one individual, this 20-year-old named Anthony Burns being brought back to slavery. And although he would be brought back, people in Massachusetts would gather up money and they would purchase his freedom. And Anthony Burns would be freed. And after this response, the public opinion that was very much changing with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law would be accelerated. There's a great quote from a businessman in Massachusetts by the name of Amos Lawrence, who said, "Before the Burns affair, we went to bed conservative, compromise Whigs, and afterwards we woke stark mad abolitionists." Different laws are passed. Changes are made. Laws known as personal liberty laws were passed in Massachusetts, which basically said that no state official or building would be used to assist in the Fugitive Slave Law. And after Anthony Burns' arrest in 1854, not a single person would be taken out of Massachusetts back to the South. And once again, we think of that Underground Railroad. We think of it very much being swept up in that American mythology. We think of it as these individual homes, these spaces, people helping individual people. But these individual choices, when they are added up, they culminate in great change. And what you see here is the shots being fired at Fort Sumter, absolutely. Beginning of the American Civil War. And the American Civil War, obviously, 4 long years of fighting, over 700,000 casualties. What emerges from that is a different nation. A nation that, still obviously, very much still today felt issues of racial discrimination, segregation, but a nation that emerges without the institution of slavery. And what I always kind of like to talk about with the American Civil War and what we think about it is you think of this Underground Railroad and the effect that it had on it. in the Articles of Secession in South Carolina, one of the major components that they focus on, one of the major reasons why they are seceding is, and I quote, "The fourth article of the Constitution stipulates also for rendition of fugitives from justice. The general government, as the common agent, passed laws to carry into effect these stipulations of the states. For many years, these laws were executed, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave-holding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations. Thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slave-holding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation." In the Articles of Secession, they are citing the Underground Railroad. They're citing one of the major reasons why they are leaving the Union is because of individuals making that choice to escape from slavery, taking that upon themselves to go north and gain their freedom. So these are very powerful stories. They're inspirational stories. And in closing, I want to end with a quote from an abolitionist, James McKim, who in 1855, I think, really captured not only what the Underground Railroad meant then, but also what it would mean. And what he said was, "These wonderful events, now being enacted before the American people, will one day be justly appreciated. Now deemed unworthy of the notice of any, save fanatical abolitionists, these acts of lofty self-sacrifice, these escapes and terrible dangers, will yet become the themes of popular literature of this nation and will excite the admiration of these generations and generations yet to come." And with that, thank you very much. I am more than happy to take some questions.
Did other states have a strong reaction as Massachusetts to the fugitive slave law, and did they also stand up to the slave hunters?
Yeah, so plenty of states also had equally as strong reactions to the fugitive slave law. Many in the North, especially states like New York, there were very strong anti-slavery communities, not just in Massachusetts. Now, obviously, we're focusing on a Massachusetts lens because that's where we are, but there are plenty of communities that came together and, in some cases, violently resisted the attempts to bring fugitives back to that institution of slavery. So this is not just a Massachusetts thing. This is absolutely something that is felt all over the northern United States.
No, you can just repeat my
Yep.
question. I was curious, if so many escaped to Canada, how did they get employment?
So that's a really good question. If a lot of people are escaping to Canada, how did they get employment? Now, I think, and I would have to do a little bit more reading to, I think, properly answer this question, but I think what you have is when people are going north to Canada, they're going to certain communities, they're encouraged to go certain places, and they're within those communities, because they are encouraging people to go to them, there can be employment found. I think that there are a lot of trades that could be had. If you're going to coastal cities, there's a lot of work to be found in maritime industries, and kind of skills that may have been acquired along the way or when making their way north, especially getting to places like certain towns in Canada. There would be opportunities where those skills for whatever town that they're in could be taught to them.
We guess the skills that they need to read and write.
Well, so the question was skills that they wouldn't need to read and write. Yes, there were definitely skills that they would acquire that maybe not necessarily learning to read and write.
Manual and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like they do now.
So manual labor, but there were also, when you're going to many of these spaces, one of the first things that people are doing are learning how to read and write. There are schools set up. You know, Lewis Hayden himself actually he first goes to Canada before settling in Boston, and he has a letter written for him to his former master, basically dictating, you know, I have made it, I am free, like I am not coming back. And he talks about how he was denied the ability to learn how to read and write in his youth, but he was learning. And he was making sure that his son was also going to school simultaneously, so he in his youth would not be denied what Lewis Hayden was. Yes?
So Shawn, could you talk a little bit about the slaves that didn't come by ship? Because I've seen stories about traveling from the south right through our country and maybe through here on the way to Canada. And also like the markings, that people, how would they know that it was a safe place? I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, sure. So the question was, what are more examples of kind of how people escape via overland routes coming through the country itself? Now, there are stories of, you know, I think they were kind of mentioned earlier, of the idea of kind of following the North Star. That's obviously a major component. And I think, honestly, a lot of it, you know, once again, kind of thinking of that idea of the mythology of it. I mean, oftentimes what would happen is people, when they escape from slavery, if they're coming, you know, let's say right over the Ohio River. You're crossing from Kentucky to Ohio. You're getting into Ohio, you're being sent to a house. Somebody is saying, go to this house, you know, there may be smoke coming from the chimney at this certain time. There may be light on in a certain window. You go to that space, you meet with that person, they then direct you to another space, to another house. But sometimes, you know, maybe you missed a train or something. Someone had a ticket for you and you weren't able to get there. Or you got lost. You know, there are stories of people, quite literally, you know, and I think the artifact you have here kind of speaks to that, is this idea of people going through the woods, people cutting through fields, people utilizing anything at their disposal to gain their freedom. You know, I think we always want to kind of look at it as a way of, you know, it's a stop, it's a stop, it's a stop. And I think it was organized, but it wasn't as seamless. You know, there are very much mistakes that could be had. And I think that it's really remarkable. It speaks to courage, and also speaks to a little bit of luck, being able to find your way, navigating through the woods, navigating to another space in unfamiliar territory. So it's impressive. And I mean, there are multiple ways to do it. You know, Frederick Douglass himself, when he escapes, a little bit on a boat, a little bit on a train, overland. Any means necessary.
Most of the slaves, they were put on ships to sell up here before the Civil War, right?
So what was it? Sorry, what was the question?
Like there's ships that would go into the deep south, and we saw at the beginning you had slaves for sale way back. So they would be transported in the ship to Boston.
No.
Is that right?
No, so basically, so slavery in Massachusetts, there were, you know, definitely businessmen that would have gone into the South, and, you know, were involved within the slave trade and kind of the intercontinental trade, slave trade. But Massachusetts abolishes slavery roughly 1783, so the end of the American Revolution. So when people are stowing away on ships, it's the idea of trading kind of material goods. So for example, one of the major businesses in Massachusetts and in New England is the textile industry. One of the major imports that is coming up here is cotton. You know, where's that cotton coming from? The southern United States. So for example, if there's a stowaway, if somebody is getting on one of those ships, they're getting on a ship that is bringing material goods up here. So they're bringing things that, would then be taken to a factory. But then what happens is maybe a ship captain then discovers that there is an individual on that boat. They don't, many ship captains didn't want to lose business relationships that they had with the South. And also, there were a lot of, in some states, grave punishments if a ship captain knowingly took a fugitive away from the South and helped them gain their freedom. There's an example of there's a very famous image of a man named Jonathan Walker, who was a ship captain, and he got caught helping a fugitive escape on a boat, and he literally got branded on his hand. And the brand was SS for slave stealer. So, I think there's great risk involved in all of these things, but you definitely have individuals. So it wouldn't be a large group of people, but individuals getting on board ships that were coming north anyway through trading routes and business practices, and using that ship, hiding on it, and getting on that and coming north.
Well, maybe I'm thinking of the movies. So many movies that show all the slaves coming in on a ship
Which very much happened. No, that's absolutely true.
from Africa to the islands.
Yeah, no, and they did come to Boston. The transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage is what I think you're thinking of. They very much came to many places in the United States, including Massachusetts. Massachusetts had slavery from roughly 1638 through 1783, so almost 150 years. All the way through the American Revolution itself. So, though not on the same scale as southern colonies, this is not an agricultural economy, there are plenty of people that are coming to Boston, to Massachusetts, to various towns throughout here, up until the American Revolution. But slavery really begins to die out in the northern United States after the American Revolution and up to the Civil War.
I still can't imagine how people would let each other know there'll be smoke in the chimney, the light would be on. They have secret meetings, the abolitionists.
Yeah, I think
They had to have.
they would not only meet, but also I think what is important to note too is there are many communities that have strong sympathies for the anti-slavery movement. And I think that, if you're meeting in a house, you have an anti-slavery group meeting in a certain space, you can talk about these things and you can create this network. And depending upon where you are, you don't have to be as secretive about it. Boston, you didn't necessarily have to be as secretive about it, but you also, you got to be aware of who your neighbors are. Because this is an illegal act. Very much so.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think about this act? Frank, what do you think?
I think it's very interesting because, especially, it very well could have. I am not necessarily an archaeologist. I can't necessarily date things, but if you have something in an area like that, it could have been a symbol.
The more I think about it, why would they put that face on it? They wanted to be secret.
Yeah, but if it's in an area that no one found it. Yeah, it could have been a sign. It could have been someone just that was in that area and was really interested in carving something. It's just the fact. If nobody found it through the 70s and you can date it back to the 1800s, no one found it.
I was just wondering how real a lot of the stories we heard were things like secret passages, underground tunnels, hidden rooms. How real was that? Because in Boston, with the Fugitive Slave Act, maybe there was enough that you did have to hide people. But you mentioned one who was then went to Cambridge and then to Concord. Did they really have to hide out there, or is it just sort of keep a low profile until they move to the next stop? How real are these places like that? Tunnels and secret rooms and stuff?
So that's a very great question. Talking about secret tunnels and passageways. This house, I've been inside it. It's caved in, but there's a tunnel in the basement. I've seen other houses that have those trapdoors. Now, I think that those very much existed, but I also think at the same time there's a lot of people that there was maybe a fugitive in town, people reacted and just had them come in their house for a little while, and then they left, and maybe that was their only interaction with harboring fugitives inside their home. Now, I think for people that are having more individuals come through their space, like Lewis Hayden, those secret passageways and those trap doors, especially if you're on a border state, you're in Pennsylvania, I think that, you know, if this is something that you are passionate about, you are invested in doing, those were a reality. But obviously those are the more juicy stories. So I think that those are very much the ones that get put up more on a pedestal, and some of those individuals that are just having fugitives come in their home, like for example, like you said, Shadrach going to Concord. That house didn't have a trap door. But that house, nonetheless, was a part of this network.
I think the Wyman house did, didn't it? Didn't have a doorway in the back? Indian?
That was for the Indian that was on the
The Indian or something? I think.
There's a separate question, just you mentioned the 1,000 to 5,000 that they had in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
How many did get returned to the South? That's a number that probably was kept track of because they were captured.
So that's a very good question. I don't know offhand what it would have been. I do know that many people didn't make it out of the South, and that's not something I would have to give you a better estimate. I would have to kind of consult some sources, but for the people that made it north and then to be returned under the fugitive slave law, that's a little bit more difficult. For example, in Boston, 5 people were arrested under the fugitive slave law, and only 3 were actually returned to the institution of slavery. Because for somebody to come back up to a northern city, A, you got to pay for yourself to get up there. B, you got to get in contact with the federal government. And then C, you're also in essentially enemy territory. I mean, Anthony, like you saw with Anthony Burns, 50,000 people are out in the streets protesting this. That's one guy who he has to come up to Boston, he stays for a week. I mean, it was definitely a lot more difficult, but with that being said, you had more people backing. You had more power backing you to have people return. So I would say that most people did not successfully make it out of the South. Most people would have been recaptured who tried to escape. But when you got here, it was definitely a lot more difficult to be arrested. But still could obviously happen. So I would have to look more into it to give you a solid figure.
What happened to those slaves who were recaptured? Before they ever got out of the South and tried to escape? What was the punishment for trying to escape?
So the question was, what was the punishment for somebody trying to escape as a slave? I mean, they were wide-ranging and sometimes, you know, horrific and brutal. There's a picture that was actually published, I think, in the New York Times in the 1860s, and it's of a man who's kind of wearing different devices that slave masters would use to prevent people from running away. Like real crude things, like iron bars around your neck with bells on them, metal boards that would be attached around your waist and put down your legs so you couldn't bend your knee. Your family could be split up. If you had a family, you escaped from slavery, you're brought back, you could be sold further south to sugarcane plantations where, the work is much more brutal and the life expectancy is like 7 years. I've seen reports of people running away multiple times and having half their foot being cut off. Like they're trying to deter people from doing that. And those are very real. Yes.
I want to go back to the wooden mask.
Yep.
Because there was an implication that it was somehow related to the Underground Railroad, and I didn't hear a lot of what you said, but it doesn't seem to me that it's at all related. I can't figure out how that would be related to the Underground Railroad. And, if it's 150 years old and it's wooden and it was in the marsh, it seems to me it wouldn't be in such good shape. So, do you see any connection at all with the Underground Railroad or that kind of thing?
I mean, personally, I'm not sure if it would be related to the Underground Railroad. I had done some research to try and see if I could identify anything in this area specifically. But with that being said, I am not an archaeologist, so necessarily being able to identify, I think the symbolism definitely looks like it would be something that is more related. to African American culture. But, you know, I think being in this area, you know, Massachusetts is a pretty well-known space in the Underground Railroad, but I could not definitively identify that as a symbol that could be used on it. However, you know, I think what the power of these symbols are is, you know, you look at these things and they create more questions than answers. And I think the beauty of that is when you're looking at symbols like this, you know, you get a question out of this and you want to learn more about it, and maybe not necessarily being able to directly tie it, but you can learn more about the surrounding areas, and, you know, that general direction that something like that would send you on would definitely, you know, I think is valuable and important.
I like what you said.
That's true. You know, it sets you off, at least learning about something that they might not know that might talk to me.
And it sparks interest. I get sent down rabbit holes all the time as a historian that I don't necessarily find what I'm looking for, but I find a bunch of other stuff that, you know, is really, that influences and is valuable. Yes?
The Jackson House, you said that was in Newton, is that open to the public?
Yes, the Jackson House is open. They have an exhibit talking about not only the role that the, kind of talking about the history of slavery in the area, but they actually also apparently have the handcuffs that Anthony Burns shackles that were used to handcuff him when he was sent back to the institution of slavery. So, you know, a lot of these things are very much interconnected. You know, I do come from Boston, so I do have a little bit of a Boston lens, but this is something that is widespread. This is not just a thing that is taking place in a city. It is very much in all of these surrounding areas here. So it's worth visiting. It's a really cool space, and definitely something that speaks to local history.
Are there other places in this area? There's the Royal Farm or whatever, and there's the Jackson Homestead and the one in Chelsea. Are there others that you know of that are not in Boston proper?
Yeah, I can, so off the top of my head, I want to think a little bit more on that to give you a more definitive answer, but I have contact information. I'm more than happy to share that. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
That house is also known as the Carey House.
The Carey House?
Carey House and Governor Valley.
Excellent. Awesome.
It's open to the public, but you gotta make it, you know, call up. I know a fellow, like I said, it's a historian, he's 97 years old, but he still has connections with that. But I mean, you have to call and just make an arrangement, a group, they bring you through it. Like you couldn't go down in that tunnel.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah, because up to the soldier, where the soldier home is.
Yeah.
They lock it down and everything.
It's really fascinating.
I just got this card in the mail, the historical commission just got it.
Uh-huh.
And it's called 2019 Lowell Lecture Series
Mm-hmm.
from Maine, Massachusetts, from Missouri, and there's 4 times that they have programs on
Mhm.
slavery and all that. So if anybody's interested in following up on this, you might be interested in that.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate you having me.